Here we are, church, on this Palm Sunday, this day that holds so much, this day that the church is called to remember Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. I would invite you to remember a day, to remember a remarkable day, a consequential day in your life's history, any day really that you'd like, just remember. Perhaps it was a day of the birth of one of your kids. Or perhaps it was a day where you lost someone very close to you. Or perhaps you might want to remember a day that lives on in infamy for so many, like 9/11. Just remember the day. Whatever day you choose, I'd invite you to remember some of the events of the day. But more so, I'd invite you to remember what it is you were feeling. It's probably a story that you have remembered and retold a time or two. So perhaps you remember retelling it to someone and telling someone how you felt scared or frightened or amped up and ready to go, whatever is demanded of you. Maybe you were overwhelmed with fear or love or both. When we take time to remember, honestly, remember those consequential days, we quickly realize how large the human heart really is, capable of holding and handling all the feels that a day might bring, even in one single moment. We remember how large the heart is, how it can hold all that a day can bring, and that it can take us a lifetime of remembering in order to learn its lessons. I'm doing a wedding for some friends of mine, and I got to meet with them this past week. The bride's brother is actually a neighbor of mine and a dear friend of mine as well, one that I call close, and so I try to be there for him whenever I can. And as we were planning this wedding, the bride tells me that her brother, my friend, gets to walk her down the aisle. Isn't that wonderful? So after I met with the couple, then I pulled out my phone to text her brother, my friend, and I said, "Hey man, I just met with your sister to plan the wedding, and I'm so glad that you get to walk her down the aisle. What an honor." and it is, right? And he agrees, right? Can you imagine that moment? And what it will be like for him. And what it will be like for her. Joyous honor for sure, but also the honor is his and the task is his alone because their father was never around. Their mother died tragically too young. Their beloved grandfather just passed away last week. Can you imagine all that their hearts will hold on that special day? So I had to add a little more to my text. Life is full of highs and lows, I told him, and sometimes they're not very far apart from one another. But our hearts are big enough to hold them. And both are time to celebrate life and to celebrate love, and both are a time to reflect on all they have to teach us. Remember. Yeah, a day can really, truly hold so much. The pastoral advice is trust yourselves. Trust yourselves that you have the capacity to hold it all together. Even if it's only in the remembering and the reflecting on it that we learn life's greatest lessons. We come to the text for today, and Palm Sunday is one of those consequential days in the life of Jesus and in the life of the church. This day that will hold within it so much for so many people. This day begins with Jesus riding into Jerusalem, triumphant, riding on a donkey. This is straight from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. And Zechariah says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus finds himself a donkey's colt, mounts up, and rides on into Jerusalem. The crowds are waving palm branches. Palm branches, by the way, symbols of national triumph and victory since Maccabean times, right? The last political revolutionary revolt that took place in Jerusalem not very long before Jesus was born. This revolt of Jewish faithful who were fed up with Roman occupation rose up an army and fought back and lost. The crowd would remember all of this, the words of the prophet and the revolution of their recent history. They would remember these things on this day when Jesus comes riding into town. And on this day, the city of Jerusalem, man, it was hopping, right? The town was full. The festival was about to get started. You know, the festival, of course, is the feast of the Passover, right? The Passover is the remembering and the religious reenacting of a time when God intervened. Not in Rome, but remember in Egypt. Not against Caesar, but remember against Pharaoh. And the Passover celebrates this act of God's liberation, and they look forward one day to when a Messiah will come from God to liberate them again. And then in comes Jesus with shouts of Hosanna, which means save us, singing praises of this one whom they call the King of Israel, who has been talking about this new kingdom that is come. They remember all this. But will they remember their songs when the day turns to Friday and they realize that Jesus isn't the king they expected nor wanted? They certainly will not remember this day how they welcomed Jesus when Pilate asks them, "Which prisoner shall I return to you, Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas?" And this crowd will choose not to remember when their songs of Hosanna turn into shouts of crucify him, crucify him. Yes, a day, man, it really can hold a lot. And what we remember, how we remember, or even that we choose to remember at all, will shape our character and will give us our identity. This day, this Palm Sunday narrative is retold in all four of our Gospels. Each Gospel, you know, has its own characteristics, its own uniquenesses, found in what they remember in the life and ministry of Jesus, as well as how they choose to remember and to retell. But that it gets remembered in all four Gospels, that is amazing. That says something too. It says it's one of only about 10 stories that will appear in all four of the Gospels, saying to us that this day is a consequential day. This day and all that it holds is a day to remember, to allow it to shape us, and for it to give us our identity. But there's one striking difference in John's gospel, as John recalls this day. John makes a stark contrast between the crowds and the disciples. When the crowds shout Hosanna, and I think confused about what kind of king Jesus will become, but the disciples, they don't join in the shouts of Hosanna. The text says the disciples did not understand all of this. They didn't understand all that the day holds. And who could, really? I mean, especially if you have the capacity to hold all that the day will bring, especially if you don't have the perspective of the whole story that is yet to be fulfilled. Notice the disciples don't misunderstand They don't misunderstand like the crowd does. They just don't understand. They haven't quite figured out the meaning of it all just yet. They don't have all the pieces to the puzzle. The disciples, they're confused. Our Lenten journey has invited us to follow Jesus up to this day, focusing in on one disciple in particular named Peter. But Peter isn't named in this day, in this story. And so we're left to imagine ourselves in the crowd. I think we're invited to experience the day and all that it has to bring, as if we were one of those disciples standing next to Peter. And I think we're invited to experience the disciples' confusion of the day. For instance, do the disciples think that Jesus is the Messiah that Zechariah prophesied, sent to be the answer to their prayerful songs of Hosanna, save us? Yeah, I think they do. Do the disciples think that answer will come, Hosanna, save us? Do they think that that answer will come in the same ways that the crowds do? I'm not so sure. I think they're confused. Do the disciples think this is a victory parade? Perhaps in John's gospel, Jesus doesn't really come out and say that I must suffer at the hands of the chief priests and elders, must die and be resurrected on the third day. At least in John's gospel, Jesus doesn't come out and say that as clearly as the other gospels do. For in John's gospel, Jesus is a little more veiled in his predictions, and he speaks of his glorification. He speaks of death and resurrection and ascension as glory. Is this a parade of glory? I don't know. The disciples are confused. Do the disciples know all that Holy Week will mean for Jesus? I think they have a clue. Do you remember when Jesus got word that his friend Lazarus is ill? And then says to them, he is dead, and then informs them that they must go to Judea to see. And remember, it's the disciples that say, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you're going there? And you'll remember that it was Thomas who said, then let us go with him, so that we may die with him. Yes, these disciples are confused, but they are not clueless. Like us, they don't quite get it all right now, but they are not naive. Unlike the crowds who are either uninformed or misinformed, and by the way, neither are proper characteristics of discipleship then nor today, but quite realistic and relatable, the more you know you really don't know. The more complicating factors a day can hold, and the more complex our role in it can be. Just like today. And it feels like this is where we live most of our days. Confused, perplexed, complicated and unsure, and hesitant in how to respond. It seems like most days I look around and say, I just don't understand. Here's my Lenten confession. While we seek to be an Easter people, it seems like most of my days feel more like Holy Week. I feel more in line with what the disciples may be experiencing here in this day, confused and scared and disappointed and questioning and faithful and impulsive and amped and excited and nervous, like whatever we have committed our lives to, it's happening soon. But what will it mean for us? As these disciples may have a clue of what it means for Jesus, do they have a clue that it might mean the same for them? Maybe. At Bible study, someone said maybe they realized on this day that this is the point of no return. And we remembered that old song, The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Yeah, man, a day can hold a lot. And what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it shapes our character and gives us our identity. John's gospel tells us that the disciples were confused, much like we can be more times than we like to admit, holding together both the joys of this life alongside the pain that comes with it. Keeping our eyes on the faith that God is in control and is exercising a plan, working for the good in all things for those who love Him, while living with eyes wide open and not naive to see that there's chaos all around us. Being torn between the crowd's fervor that is so tempting to join in with, knowing that it can lead to the mob mentality of crucify Him if we let it. Jumping into action when a moment calls upon us, yet leaving room for humble contemplation of what exactly is our proper place among it. Feeling all the feels of hope and hopelessness, laughing through the tears, empathizing and experiencing the loss of another, and yet offering the salve of gratefulness for the loss shows that it was worth losing. And a myriad of other ways in which a heart can hold together all the things a day can bring, and hold together all a life has to give, and calls us to give as we live. And John's gospel says at first the disciples, they just don't understand until they remember. And it shapes their character. And it gives them their identity. See, when John is telling this story, John breaks the fourth wall of storytelling, and he invites us, the audience, to see what the disciples don't see themselves on this day, that they were confused, but that later they will understand. Like one day we will all understand by and by, right? The text tells us eventually they will understand all that day holds, but not until. But not until after they follow Jesus deeper and they understand Jesus further and then misunderstand Jesus even more. Not until after they join in a hopeful meal that will be marked by the betrayal from a brother. Not until after they are loved and washed by their Savior, then deny Him when they think He isn't listening. Yeah, they won't understand this day until after, when they can look back on this day and they can remember. And the question for us is, well, what will they remember? Will they remember their faults and their failures, and indeed those two can teach us something? Or will their remembering have a different focus? Not on what they've done or left undone so much as what Jesus had to offer. Remembering what Jesus had to offer on a day that asked so much of Him. I hope they remembered, and I hope we remember that when our days are marked by confusion and more of it than certainty, I hope we'll remember the words that John chose to remember this day. As Jesus enacted the prophet Zechariah's vision, victorious and mounted on a colt, the prophet has the king saying, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, and shout aloud." But instead, in John's gospel, as John chooses to remember it, Jesus says, not rejoice, for it's hard to rejoice when you don't understand. Instead, Jesus says, fear not. In the midst of confusion and misunderstanding, Jesus leads with, do not be afraid. For Jesus knows full well what the day holds. Jesus knows full well what the week will bring. Jesus knows full well how fickle and complicated life and crowds and emotions and decisions will be. Jesus knows with every ounce of his blood how cruel this world can be. And Jesus knows even still that this is the world that God so loved. That God would send his only Son into this world, not to condemn this world, but to save this world. Hosanna indeed. And as John remembers the day, he remembers the Pharisees saying, quite ironic and quite true, the Pharisees will say, look how the world goes after him. Hosanna indeed. So please, even in the confusion of our days, remember. Remember this Lenten journey. This Lenten journey that we've been on together that reminds us that Jesus still calls us. That Jesus still offers us abundance. That Jesus still reaches out his hand to us when we call out to him from the storms of life to save us. Jesus still rejoices and praises when we confess him. And Jesus still models for us forgiveness and grace 7 times, 77 times, 7 times 77. And remember this day. Jesus still enters into Jerusalem and into our lives and into our even most confusing days and says, do not be afraid. No matter what the day will hold, Christ will enter it triumphantly. Even when we're confused, remember, one day we will understand on the other side of cross, of Easter, of glory. One day we'll remember this day and we'll rejoice. We'll know what it's all been for. Remember that. Let it shape your character. Let it give you your identity as a disciple of Jesus, the one true King. Hosanna indeed.